Happy Easter! This is the second week of Eastertide. I hope that the message of the gospel is encouraging you, even in this strange, unsettling, disruptive time of the COVID pandemic. I wanted to update you on a few things for this Missio Day video update. First, I wanted to let you know that we miss you. And we, the elders at One Hope, are praying for you by name, and praying that God's blessing on you, and that in this time that you are able to draw near to God in fresh ways and learn new things about God and learn new things about yourself, even in this, shall we say, this extended Lent period. I wanted to let you know as well that even in the midst of this strange time, we have been able to continue our pastor search, and we're grateful for that. We have a number of really strong candidates, and we are conducting interviews right now, and we trust that God will be providing for us through this time. So we encourage you to continue to pray for that search. Pray that God would be preparing that person for our to shepherd our lovely church. When I recently in one of the interviews, one of the candidates asked, "What's the best thing about our church?" And for me, without hesitation, it was the people. We really have a great community. I'm so grateful for you all, and really look forward to seeing who God's going to raise up to shepherd us in these next years, decades, hopefully, to come. I did want to remind you once again that in the lectionary that we'll be going through during Easter season, the lectionary focuses on 1 Peter and the book of Acts and the Gospel of John. So I'd encourage you to kind of do a deep dive in those three books. If you're looking for something to read, read John, 1 Peter, read the book of Acts. I'd also encourage you, as we reflect upon the image of wilderness for Christian identity, to go back and read the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as a way of familiarizing yourself with those stories. So those are some things that you could read that would be really helpful, and I think shaping for you and your family, and in this time. In this particular video update, I'm going to begin a series that I'm calling Wilderness Christianity. As we've been reflecting on 1 Peter during Eastertide, you may remember that wilderness is a kind of central theme, and I've always been struck, as I do a lot of work in the New Testament, by the ways in which a number of authors use wilderness to shape our Christian identity. So this will be the first installment. This will be called Wilderness Christianity Part 1, 1 Peter, and I want to share with you give you a little more texture to the ways in which Peter develops this theme that we touched on a little bit last Sunday on our second Sunday of Easter message. I'm going to post what I say on this video in written form on my blog, and I'm going to post that on the Facebook page. I would encourage you to subscribe to that blog. I put all kinds of things on there, including usually either my notes to my sermon or sometimes my manuscript for my sermon, some other things that I'm working on. So I would encourage you to, on the blog, right in this top center, it says subscribe. Just click on there, and then every time I post something, it'll send you an email to let you know that something new's up there. So I would encourage you to do that. Encourage you also to subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is the means by which we've been getting out some of the sermons and scripture readings and other things. So it's one way that I'm able to kind of communicate to you and deliver some of the things that God has given me to say. So I encourage you to do that. So I want to start then with this message, this reflection on wilderness Christianity in 1 Peter. So one of the more interesting and often neglected themes in the New Testament is that of wilderness. for a number of New Testament authors, they look to the wilderness as a helpful way of understanding what it is that Jesus has accomplished, but also for fomenting Christian identity and mission. To be clear, the wilderness these New Testament authors have in mind is Israel's sojourn out of Egypt and slavery and towards their inheritance, what we might call the Promised Land. This journey is cataloged in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and it's remembered in a variety of ways in the Psalms, and in particular Psalm 95, Psalm 105, 106, but many others. It's important to note that the Old Testament itself draws upon the story of the Exodus and uses it as a paradigm for explaining and anticipating a future restoration that will impact not only Israel, but also the entire world. So in a variety of ways, the Old Testament prophets such as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea and Micah and Zechariah speak of a day in which God will again redeem his people from exile and slavery and fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 and 3. The promise he made to Moses in Exodus 19, 4 to 6, for example, and David in 2 Samuel 7, to fulfill his covenant that was intended to bring peace and restoration to the whole world. In the following posts that I'm going to entitle Wilderness Christianity, I want to detail some of the ways in which New Testament authors, taking their cues from the Old Testament, link the first Exodus to this second Exodus by means of the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus as a way of shaping Christian identity and mission. So we begin in this first episode with 1 Peter. Now we saw last Sunday in our second Sunday of Easter, 1 Peter 1, 3 to 9, how Peter identifies his readers with 2 terms that were first given to Israel when they were called out of Egypt. He calls them elect sojourners. This word elect and this word sojourner in the ESV sometimes, well, in the ESV it's translated as exile. But I showed you on Sunday that he wants both these terms to shape our imagination. As elect ones, as the chosen ones, we're reminded that God has graciously initiated with us, and he's redeemed us from slavery, and he's called us to himself, and he's given us a special responsibility to represent him to the world. As sojourners or exiles, we're reminded that we are called to live out this privileged position in the context of alienation or foreignness. That's to say that we live out our faithfulness or our allegiance to God in places where we will be misunderstood, where we are seen as foreigners, where other gods are called upon and trusted in. We are fundamentally people who do not belong, who are on our way to an inheritance, a home that is prepared but has yet been fully revealed. So there are a number of ways that Peter illustrates this in 1 Peter 1:1 to 2:10, and I want to kind of give a little texture to this. I want to flesh this out. For example, he declares that we have been redeemed. Now that's an important word because that word redeemed is a word that reminds the original readers of the word that was used to describe Israel when they were redeemed from Egypt. So he says, specifically says, you were redeemed by the precious blood of Christ, our unblemished Passover lamb, in 1 Peter 1, 18 to 19. You can compare that to Exodus 12. He describes our present condition as one in which we are faced with a variety of tests or temptations while we journey to our inheritance. 1 Peter 1, 4 to 7. We live in a liminal state, an in-between time between redemption and inheritance. And he emphasizes the need to be obedient to this new way that God has called us to, no longer being conformed to our Egyptian lifestyle and upbringing, if you will. The third exhortation of the letter is a refrain that is echoed throughout the wilderness tradition of the Old Testament, especially in the book of Leviticus. This phrase is repeated over and over again. Be holy, for I am holy. In chapter 2 of 1 Peter, he points his readers to the original wilderness call to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You find this in 1 Peter 2, 5, and then 1 Peter 2, 9. And this can be compared to Exodus 19, 5, and 6. He declares that this privileged, representative, mediatory calling has been enabled by the life and death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, through whom we offer spiritual sacrifices mediated by the Spirit to God. It's important to note that Peter makes an interesting move here in 1 Peter 1, 1 to 2:10. He links this Exodus imagery with promises of a second Exodus. For example, he says that the new birth that they have received in Jesus Christ is in keeping with the promise made in Isaiah 40. Most Old Testament scholars acknowledge that Isaiah 40 is the prologue to a much larger unit, Isaiah 40 to 55, in which God declares that he will restore his exiled people, that he will be faithful to his covenant, that he will redeem his people from their sins and continue his mission to put the world right. Now, it's throughout Isaiah 40 to 55 that this fresh work of God is described in terms of a new or a second Exodus. We see this in subtle ways in 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10, when Peter declares that they are a, quote, chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. What he's doing is actually combining phrases from Exodus 19, 5, and 6 and phrases from Isaiah 43:20 and interspersing them all in that one line. And it's important that to understand that this text, Isaiah 43:20, is a text that speaks of God's second Exodus work that he will initiate through his servant, this mysterious servant that pops up over and over again in Isaiah 40 to 55. So when in that next verse in 1 Peter 2:10, when Peter declares that we were once not a people, but now we are a people, God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. He's alluding to Hosea 1:6 and 1:9 and 1:10, and then also Hosea 2:23. By now, it's unsurprising to know that this prophetic passage of Hosea 1 to 2 describes God's fresh act of redemption, his renewal of covenant faithfulness in terms of a second Exodus, in which he will heal us from our disease of idolatry and draw us into the wilderness, as he did in the first Exodus, and continue the promises that he made to Abraham and to Israel. Peter culminates this link between the first Exodus and the second Exodus in the central passage of 1 Peter, chapter 2, verse 21 to 25. I wish we had time to go into detail on this, but I'll say just this overarching sort of summary of this passage. He characterizes Jesus in 1 Peter 2, 21 to 25 as the mysterious suffering servant of Isaiah 53. He says that the humiliation and death that Jesus experienced, which is described in the Passion narratives, the Gospels that recount Jesus' suffering, not only parallel the Gospels, but they also parallel what we read in Isaiah 53. And when we read Isaiah 53, we realize that this suffering servant accomplishes the second Exodus goal of returning God's people back to the Good Shepherd. Now, if you had time, go read Ezekiel 34, Jeremiah 23, Zechariah 9 through 14, and you'll realize that what's going on here in 1 Peter 2, 21 and 25 is that Peter is saying that this Jesus is the one who has accomplished this. He's restored the Davidic kingdom. He is the shepherd. He will reign forever. Now, this brief survey of the imaginative exegetical work of Peter illustrates what he has declared in the beginning of his letter in 1 Peter 1, 10 to 12, where he says that the prophets prophesied about this salvation, this grace that is now ours. He says these prophets are serving us, announcing to us the good news by the Holy Spirit. It's important to underscore that Peter builds all of his exhortations on the imagery of second Exodus discipleship. That's to say that as he seeks to shape a new identity for those who have pledged their allegiance to Jesus Christ, he does so in this overarching framework of a second Exodus. So it's unsurprising now that in 1:13 he says, therefore girding the loins of your mind for action. Now that's the literal translation, and it's the phraseology that comes right out of Exodus 12:11 about girding your loins in the Passover. He says, girding the loins of your mind for action. He says, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation or return of Jesus. As I've already pointed out, he says, as obedient children, don't be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but instead be holy as I am holy. In 1:17, he says, conduct yourselves with fear throughout our time of sojourning. The ESV translate that as exile, but it could just as easily be translated sojourning. In 2:11, he says, as sojourners and exiles, abstain from the passions of your flesh. And in 1 Peter 2:21, he says, you've been called to suffer as Christ did. This Christ that he's just about to explain is the kind of actualization of Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant. So he says that this Christ left us an example that we should follow. Now, in the season of Easter, I would like us to consider what it means that Peter and others, as we'll see in this series, compel us to think about the significance of the resurrection in terms of a second Exodus wilderness journey. To meditate on this imagery as a way of grappling with the implication of the resurrection for our lives. Because this is what the authors of the New Testament are asking us to do. They're describing the resurrection in terms of an actualization of the second Exodus. So how does this help shape our expectations? How does this help shape our experience of hardship? How does this orient us? That's the work we have to do. And I encourage you to do that in this season of Eastertide. But I want to give you 7 brief thoughts that I have on what this means for us, and very brief, with 7 words that orient us: gratitude, hope, humility, resistance, blessing, loyalty, witness. Gratitude. Wilderness reminds us that we are no longer in Egypt. We are no longer enslaved to the feudal ways we've inherited from our father, Adam. In an act of grace, God has initiated with us to deliver us from that which we could not save ourselves. We love because he first loved us. We live because Christ died for us. 1 Peter begins and ends with grace. May grace be multiplied to you, he says in 1:2. Set your hope fully on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, 1:13. The God of all grace will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you, 5:10. Stand in this true grace of God, 5:12. Our fitting response to this grace is gratitude, thanks. Hope. We're shaped by the promises that God has given us in Jesus Christ. We orient our lives, everything we do, around this hope, these promises. So as such, we recognize that we live in an in-between time. We're not discouraged when we are told we don't belong. We are when we are misunderstood, when we suffer. For we know that our lives are being preserved for the promises that God has already delivered on in Jesus Christ. Humility. We're not called to make our own way in this world. God has a plan for us, and he will execute it on our behalf. We can therefore humble ourselves under God's mighty hand, because we know that he will exalt us at the proper time, 1 Peter 5:6. Resistance. One of the primary ways in which we live out our allegiance to Jesus is in resisting the idolatry of our age. We say no to the false promises of the false gods in our midst. We say no to this present age that seeks to conform us to the world. Blessing. We live to be a blessing to our neighbors, just as Israel was called to be a blessing. We have been made elect sojourners for the sake of blessing our neighbors and the nations, 3:9. Loyalty. We are not measured by worldly success, but rather by our fidelity or our faithfulness to God in the wilderness. And finally, witness. Tests, trials, temptations, hardships provide us the opportunity to bear witness to God and his mission, to his care for our lives and his love for the world. This is what God is doing in and through us in our time of wilderness sojourning. Well, there are no doubt many other implications, and I would encourage you to explore them in this time and please feel free to share some of your insights and thoughts in the comments, either on the blog or on the video. But we conclude with our declaration and our profession. He is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.